Hold on to your hats because we're about to rewrite the history books. You've probably learned about Columbus and his discovery, but what if I told you there is a whole other story, a thrilling saga of exploration that predates him by centuries? Imagine a world where ancient maps were mere whispers and the horizon held only the promise of the unknown. This isn't a fantasy, it's the reality faced by a legendary Viking explorer. Picture him, a fearless mariner, charting a course through treacherous seas, guided by the stars and sheer grit. His destination, a vast continent teeming with secrets, a land so foreign and untamed it would test the limits of human endurance. This explorer, whose name is now whispered more than shouted, didn't just stumble upon new lands. He navigated a world filled with both awe-inspiring wonders and bone-chilling dangers. His voyages weren't just about claiming territory, they were about pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible, about seeking out the mysteries that lay hidden across the vast, unforgiving ocean. So, let's set aside the familiar narratives and dive deep into the shadows of history to uncover the incredible, often overlooked story of a Viking who truly ventured into the heart of a continent that was, for all intents and purposes, entirely new. The air grows heavy, the subtle, rhythmic thump of your own heart against the pillow transforming. It is no longer the sound of sleep approaching, but the drumming resonance of oak, planks under straining rope, the relentless, cold pulse of the North Atlantic. You are no longer bound by soft linen and quiet walls. You are lashed to the present moment, a shield-bearer by trade, a seer by necessity, standing heel-deep in the brine-wash of a longship named Drenga, the Valiant One. The transition is instantaneous and total. The smell of cedar, stale sweat, and drying cod hits you first, sharp and vital. The wind is a living thing, an icy wolf that howls through the single patched square of wool that serves as the sail. It whips the salt spray across your face, instantly freezing the exposed hair on your beard. You reflexively pull your worn, damp woolen cloak tighter, the heavy iron clasp digging into your collarbone. You are 29 days out from the western edge of Greenland, sailing past the map, Zedge, where the parchment turns to mythical sea serpents and the promises of Odin. This is the venture of Brant Sigurdsson, the captain, a man whose eyes hold the perpetual grey intensity of an Arctic winter sky. He stands at the stern, his massive hand gripping the steering oar, his profile etched against the monstrous, unforgiving horizon. Brant is driven not by the lure of easy silver or soft furs, but by the relentless whisper of destiny, a rumour of land so vast, so rich in timber and vine, that it would dwarf even Miklagard, Constantinople. You, the trusted few, signed on for glory, but now, facing the endless, churning expanse, the glory looks suspiciously like a cold, watery grave. The Western Ocean. For weeks, the sea has been a constant, grinding antagonist. Days blur into a monotonous cycle of bailing, shivering and rationing water that tastes faintly of pitch. The nights are worse. Stars sharp as shattered glass above, the sea below a black, hungry entity trying to swallow the sky. Hold fast, the tiller. Brant's roar is snatched away by a sudden rogue wave that hits the port side like a hammer blow. You brace your legs, muscles burning against the tilt, the icy water washing over your boots. Your focus is absolute, the integrity of the mast, the tension of the shrouds, the grim faces of your shipmates. Eric the Red's grandson, stout Gunnar, and young pale Thorfinn, whose fear is a palpable scent. The fear, however, is not just of the sea. It is the fear of the unknown that presses down harder than the deepest depths. Tails circle the narrow deck like vultures, of the Hafgufa, the massive sea monster that mimics an island, waiting to swallow ships, of the Trollkona, the spirit woman who drags sailors deep into the silt. As the sun, a weak disk of bruised copper, dips below the horizon, Brant calls for the sail to be reefed. The men begin their rhythmic chant, a low, guttural prayer against the dark. "How much longer, Jarl?" Gunnar asks, his voice raw. Brant doesn't look away from the west. "The ravens tell me it is close. The very scent of the air has changed. It is sweeter, heavier than the ice." And he is right. As the days bleed into the 45th sunrise, a subtle shift occurs. The relentless, biting cold eases, replaced by a damp, earthy coolness. Then the smell, not of ice or salt, but of decay and rich living things. The landfall, Helluland and Markland. One morning, the lookout, usually a man of dour silence, lets out a strangled cry that is half terror, half ecstasy. Land, land to port. Great gods, it is land. You rush to the bow, scrambling over coiled mooring ropes, your eyes straining against the thick sea mist. Slowly, agonizingly, the white curtains of fog part, revealing not the soft, grassy meadows promised in the sagas, but an immense, terrifying coastline. It is a land of rock and ice, Helluland, slabland. Jagged, black stone cliffs rise straight out of the churning water, topped by vast silent glaciers that look like the frozen shoulders of giants. It is beautiful in its raw hostility, a continent that screams, "You are not welcome here." Brant, however, grins a chilling, exhilarated grin. We do not seek stone but timber. South men, follow the sun. For 3 days, you follow the intimidating coastline south, the cliffs, gradually ceding to a more welcoming, though still forbidding, landscape. The scent intensifies. It becomes the deep, resinous perfume of countless trees, pines, spruce and fir, stretching inland, darkening the air, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of green. This is Markland, forestland. The longship is steered into a small, sheltered cove, the water turning from oceanic blue to shallow, clear emerald. The moment the keel scrapes the unknown sand, the silence is profound. The roaring of the sea is muted, the only sounds are the drip of water, from the oar blades and the beating of your own adrenaline-fueled heart. You are the first ashore, wielding your heavy axe, testing the ground. It is firm, springy with millennia of decayed needles and mosses. The massive trees soar overhead, blocking the sun, creating a natural cathedral-like gloom that feels ancient and waiting. Pushing deeper, the promised Vinland. Markland provides the timber they desperately need, but not the settlement they crave. Food is scarce, and the looming darkness of the forests presses on the nerves of the men. Still driven south by the promise of grapes, the legendary vin, and soft grass, the drenga sails for another week, following maps that exist only in Brant's fiercely determined mind. Finally, they find it. The land is flatter, less shadowed. A wide river mouth opens into a large, freshwater lake. Here, the grass grows tall enough to hide a man, and the air is noticeably warmer. You moor the drenga and begin the arduous work of establishing a temporary winter camp. Logs are felled, earthworks are raised, and the air rings with the sound of axes. This is their foothold, their claim against the wilderness, a single, stout longhouse near the river, its gable facing the foreign sea. It is here, in Vinland, that the true nature of their historic mistake, or triumph, begins to reveal itself. The silent watchers. For the first few weeks, the land seems empty, vast and silent. Too silent. One afternoon, while you are hauling water from the river, you feel it. The prickling certainty of being watched. You drop the bucket, grip the hilt of your sword, and turn slowly. The deep shadows of the forest remain motionless, but you know you are not alone. It is not the watchfulness of an animal, it is the calculated, patient scrutiny of sentient beings. You rush back to the fledgling settlement, urging caution. Brant dismisses the fear as wilderness jitters, a common malady among isolated men, but his dismissiveness is a mask. He too has seen the subtle signs, brush intentionally piled, small, smooth river stones carefully placed on the periphery of the camp, signs that speak of organization and intelligence. The watchers are the Skraelings, wretches or foreigners, the original people of this continent. The encounters start innocently, terrifyingly. Small, swift figures glimpsed at the edge of the clearing. A high-pitched, unintelligible cry echoing from the deep woods at dusk. Weapons, arrows tipped with unfamiliar, sharpened slate, found piercing the newly built palisade wall. You realize they are masters of this land. They move through the dense forest floor with the silence of falling snow, utterly invisible until they choose to be seen. The first encounter, the inevitable clash, occurs during the 3rd week of construction, under a bruised autumn sky. A group of 7 men, including you and Brant, are cutting wood a quarter-mile from the longhouse. The sounds of the axes cover the approach. Gunnar is the first to fall. A sharp, wet thwack of an arrow finding its mark, and the giant drops. Silently, an expression of shocked disbelief frozen on his face. Instantly, the woods explode, not with a charge, but with a terrifying coordinated attack based on speed and deception. Figures, clad in tanned hides and smeared earth, materialize from the trees. They are smaller than the Vikings, dark-haired, their faces painted. With ochre and soot, their movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. Brant immediately forms a shield wall with the remaining men, roaring orders, his great axe already singing. Tighten up, do not break the line. They rely on speed. You raise your shield, the iron rim scraping against the shield of the man beside you. The air buzzes with arrows. You feel a heavy impact on your left arm, a glancing blow from a cudgel, and the world tilts slightly. The pain is sharp, cold, and immediate. The Skraelings do not fight like the Saxons or the Irish. They strike, withdraw, and circle, leveraging the trees as cover, their intent clearly to isolate and confuse. One charges the line, screaming a sound that is not war cry, but pure, terrifying rage. He is fearless, armed with a stone-tipped spear. Brant steps forward, catches the spear on the edge of his shield, and brings his axe down in a swift, brutal arc. The attackers momentarily falter, pulling back into the absolute shelter of the wood line. You stand there, breathing heavily, tasting the coppery tang of blood in the back of your throat. The silence returns, heavier and more menacing than before. You have won the skirmish, but the victory feels hollow, the cost too high. Gunnar lies dead, and young Thorfinn is nursing a spear wound in his thigh. They will return, Brant whispers, his eyes hard and focused on the black heart of the forests. They know we are here now, the price of memory. As the deep, crushing cold of the Vinland winter begins to settle, binding the river in thick ice and dusting, the longhouse roof with snow, the full weight of your isolation settles upon you like a physical burden. You are 3,000 miles from the familiar coastline of Iceland facing a fierce, organized enemy whose very existence is unknown to the world. You are an infinitesimal historical anomaly, a forgotten spike in the timeline of man. Yet, here you remain. You survive not for glory, but for the fundamental primal need to carry this truth back across the endless, storm-racked sea. The knowledge that this land exists, vast, beautiful, and savagely protected, must not perish in the snow. The wind rattles the longhouse door, a sound strangely like a breath drawn across the vast mouth of the winter. You shift your weight, the imagined cold of the damp woolen blanket and the ache in your left arm remaining intensely real. You know now the true nature of this undiscovered continent. It is a land of unimaginable resources, but guarded by an ancient, unforgiving spirit, ready to swallow any who dare to trespass. This is the saga that was lost. The fear, the cold, the enduring smell of pine resin and ozone. It clings. To you, a cold, historical tattoo burned into your subconscious. You are the witness, the silent bearer of a truth that history chose to forget, until now. The floorboards of your imaginary longhouse groan one last time against the weight of the snow, and the vast, dark emptiness of the unknown ocean finally begins to recede. But the memory of the chilling, silent forest and the glint of stone weapons in the gloom, that remains. And as the last vestiges of the dream finally surrender to the deep, heavy darkness of your real sleep, you know one thing with crystalline clarity: the Americas were discovered not once, but countless times, each journey a whisper into the deaf, vast ear of history. And you were there for the most perilous of them all. Now dare to dream that. The wind, a biting tutor, whipped at your cloak, tearing at the edges of your and your ancestors' known world. You stand at the prow of the longship, the Canor, its stout oak hull groaning beneath you as it slices through the churning waters of the North Atlantic. Behind you, the jagged, ice-choked fjords of Greenland are fading into a smudgy memory. A harsh, beautiful land that could no longer sate the growing hunger of your people. What drove you? What drove us? It wasn't just the promise of silver or the glory sung in sagas, though those certainly held their sway in the mead halls. It was a quieter, more primal gnawing. Greenland, green land, a hopeful misnomer spun by Eric the Red, was a cruel mistress. Its pastures were sparse, its timber precious, its winters long and unforgiving. The whispers that carried across the sea weren't just tales of monstrous sea serpents and sun-drenched bountiful lands, but of necessity, of new hunting grounds, of rich timber for ships and homes, of meadows that didn't constantly fight against the encroaching ice. It was the ancestral call of a people forever pushing the boundaries, carving out existence from the unforgiving edge of the world. It was a profound, almost spiritual need to see what lay beyond the next horizon, a relentless curiosity etched into the Norse soul. And so, with a mix of desperate hope and audacious courage, you chose to embark. You remember the day we set sail. The air was thick with the smell of tarred ropes, salted fish, and the nervous sweat of strong men. The women and children, their faces etched with a blend of pride and palpable fear, waved. From the shore, their figures shrinking as the Nor dipped and rose with the swell. The mast, a lone, stark cross against the boundless grey sky, held the square sail, patched and stained, but strong. Beneath it, the dragon's head carved into the prow seemed to snarl, ready to devour the unknown. Your hands, calloused from years of gripping oars and axes, instinctively tighten on the rough-carved wood of the gunwale. The chill seeps into your bones, a constant companion. Days bleed into weeks, marked only by the shifting light of the sun, and the moon, and the relentless rhythmic rise and fall of the ship. The world shrinks to the confines of your vessel, a floating village of 40 souls. You learn to sleep amidst the groans of timbers, the slap of waves, the creak of ropes, and the murmuring prayers of your companions. The deck is a slippery, treacherous dance floor. Salt spray, icy as a winter bath, lashes your face constantly, crusting your beard and eyebrows. Your skin grows raw, your clothes stiff with dried salt. Every movement is a struggle against the ship's sway, every step a calculated risk. Below deck, the air is thick with the scent of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the meager provisions of dried meat, fermented milk and hardtack. The thirst is eternal, quenched only by sips of water from the casks, carefully rationed by the stoic Helgi, our provisions master. Did you ever feel truly dry? Did you ever feel truly warm? Fear, a cold serpent, coils in the pit of your stomach during the violent storms. The sky turns a bruised purple, then black, swallowing the horizon whole. Waves, taller than any longhouse, crash over the ship, threatening to tear the mast from its step. The Nor becomes a toy in the grip of the ocean, tossed and spun, her crew clinging to anything solid. You bail water relentlessly, your muscles screaming, your heart a frantic drumbeat against your ribs. Above the roar of the wind and sea, the shouts of the Jarl, Leif Erikson, are barely audible. Yet his presence, his unshakable calm, somehow transmits itself through the chaos. He stands at the steering oar, a silhouette against the stormy sky, his eyes fixed forward, a beacon of defiant will. In those moments, when the world seemed determined to swallow you whole, doubt gnawed. Did the sagas truly speak of fortunes, or only glorious deaths? Was this boundless, indifferent ocean truly meant to be tamed by men of flesh and bone? But then, the storm would break. The sun, a welcome, blinding eye, would pierce the remaining clouds, illuminating a world of sparkling, endless blue. The crew, exhausted but alive, would emerge, cheering, slapping each other on the back, sharing a flask of watered mead. Hope, a stubborn weed, would bloom again. Navigation was an art of patient observation and ancient lore. No charts guided you, only the sun's arc by day, the North Star by night, and the flight patterns of seabirds. We watched for whales, for the telltale greening of the water, for driftwood that spoke of distant shorelines. Each day, the Hrafn raven was released, a feathered scout sent to search for land. Most times, it would circle, then return, a silent harbinger of continued ocean. But you remembered the day Leif's Hrafn did not return, instead flying west, disappearing into the vast expanse. A tremor of excitement, quickly suppressed by a hardened practicality, ran through the crew. Days passed, blurring into an endless cycle of watch, bail, eat, sleep. The monotony could be as brutal as any storm. Stories were told of old gods and heroes, songs were sung in low voices, and quiet games of skill played with carved bone pieces. Each man carried his own burden of memories and hopes, but a shared purpose bound us. We were Vikings, yes, but more than that, we were a desperate expedition, seeking a future. Then, weeks after leaving Greenland's shores, the signs grew stronger. Not just the birds, but an undeniable scent on the wind, the earthy, profound smell of pine forests, damp soil, and something wild and fresh that was not the ocean. You caught it first, a subtle shift in the air, a sweetness where before there had only been salt. You looked to the horizon, your eyes straining, willing it to reveal itself. And then it did. A dark line, barely discernible at first, a faint smudge against the western sky. Not the jagged, familiar peaks of Iceland or Norway, nor the icy austerity of Greenland. This was different, lower, flatter, shrouded in an ethereal mist. Whispers ran through the ship, growing into triumphant shouts. Land! Land! The cry went up, hoarse and joyful, echoing across the waves. The exhaustion of weeks, the gnawing fear, the endless monotony, all vanished in that single, exhilarating moment. As we drew closer, the land resolved itself into towering cliffs, dark and forbidding, softened by the green of trees. This was a northern place, colder than the Vinland of the sagas, but undeniably rich in timber, unlike the barren lands we'd left behind. This was Helluland, the land of flat stones, as Leif would later name it, likely the eastern coast of what you now know as Baffin Island. We didn't linger. This was not the lush land of bounty we sought. Further south, the landscape softened. We navigated through a maze of islands and inlets, the water teeming with unfamiliar fish. This was Markland, forest land, a land of dense timber, the kind of wood that was a king's ransom back home. You saw trees so tall their tops disappeared into the clouds, a forest so vast it felt like a living, breathing entity. Here, the air was sweeter, the game more plentiful. But still, the search continued, driven by the saga's tantalizing hints of grapes and richer pastures. Finally, after what felt like an eternity traversing coastlines, following the sun's promise, we sailed into a wide bay. The water was calm, sheltered by low hills, and there, stretching inland, were meadows so green they seemed to glow. The air was rich with the scent of unfamiliar berries, and yes, by the grace of Odin, the telltale twining vines heavy with wild grapes. You picked one, its tart sweetness bursting on your tongue, a taste of sheer, unadulterated victory. This was it. This was Vinland. We dropped anchor in a quiet cove, the grinding sound of the anchor chain a stark contrast to the silence of this untouched world. The collective sigh of relief from the crew was almost audible. You felt the solid earth beneath your boots again, a glorious, comforting weight after weeks of the ocean's ceaseless rocking. Leif, ever pragmatic, chose a sheltered spot near a stream where the land sloped gently to the shore. Your muscles, stiff from the voyage, protested, but the work was urgent. Under the watchful eyes of the scouts, axes rang, splitting logs, clearing ground. Within days, the skeleton of a settlement began to rise, turf houses, sturdy and low, designed to withstand the coming winter. A smithy, for working the bog iron we soon discovered in the swamps. A treasure beyond measure. A longhouse, for communal living, its sturdy beams speaking of permanence. As you helped to raise the timbers, did you notice the subtle shift in the forest? The snapping twig that wasn't from a deer? The glint of eyes in the darkness beyond the torchlight? The land was not empty. It was watchful. We were not alone. The harsh realities of the voyage may have ended, but new, extraordinary challenges had just begun. The vast, unknown ocean was behind you. The vast, unknown continent lay before you, and in the silent, watchful woods, something else stirred, ready to test the limits of your courage, and your people's claim to this new world. You had reached the edge of the world, and in doing so, had opened a new chapter not just for your people, but for the history of mankind itself, thousands of years before the name Columbus would ever be uttered. You were part of something monumental, something that would shape the future, even if the world wouldn't fully grasp it for centuries to come. The decision had been made, the omens read, and the longship, Serpent's Embrace, christened, with ale and ancient rites, now cut through the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. A new voyage for you and the Viking crew. You stood on the deck, the biting wind whipping your hair, the taste of salt already a permanent fixture on your lips. Greenland, a distant memory, had been the last true land, a rugged, icebound stepping stone. Now, only the endless expanse of the greedy sea lay between you and the whispers of a land further west. Vinland, Markland, Helluland, names that danced on the tongues of skalds and dreamers, now a tangible, terrifying goal. The initial days, fueled by the dwindling joy of departure and the camaraderie of your fellows, quickly dissolved into a grim routine. The North Atlantic, a living, breathing entity, wasted no time in revealing its true, savage nature. It wasn't a journey, it was a battle for survival waged against an adversary as ancient and indifferent as time itself. You learned quickly that the sagas, for all their poetic flair, could never truly capture the raw, bone-deep terror of a storm at sea. One moment, the sky might be a vast, indifferent grey, the waves merely rolling mountains of cold, dark water. The next, the world would erupt. You remember distinctly the storm that lashed out from the northwest, a beast of wind and water that descended with the suddenness of a wolf pack. The sky turned a bruised purple, then an inky black, swallowing the sun whole. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail that tore at the edges of your sanity, threatening to rip the very sails from their masts. The Serpent's Embrace, for all its sturdy oak and cunning design, became a toy in the hands of giants. You clung to the gunwale, knuckles white, the spray a constant icy slap across your face. Waves, not merely large but gargantuan, rose like liquid mountains there, foaming crests towering above you, threatening to engulf the entire ship. The longship would climb one, groaning and straining with every plank, only to plunge into the trough with a stomach-lurching drop, the impact shaking your very bones. Water poured over the deck, swirling around your ankles, threatening to sweep you overboard into the churning, inescapable abyss. You bailed alongside your kinsmen, a relentless, desperate rhythm of scoop and heave, the icy water chilling you to the core. Sleep was impossible, replaced by a constant primal vigilance, a prayer on your lips to Odin and Thor, a desperate hope that the mast would hold, that the hull wouldn't splinter, that the dawn would come. Navigation was a desperate art, a testament to the wisdom passed down through generations. No instruments of metal or glass guided your path, only the sun, when it deigned to show its face, and the stars. At night, when the clouds cleared, you would see the pole star, a beacon, unwavering and distant, and the more experienced seafarers among you would read the shifting patterns of the constellations, charting a course by intuition and experience. By day it was the sun's arc, the direction of the wind upon your cheek, the flight of birds, and the occasional drifting debris, a branch, a clump of seaweed, that offered a whisper of direction. Dead reckoning, the painstaking process of estimating your position based on speed and time, was a constant calculation, etched not on parchment, but in the minds of the Jarl and his most trusted navigators. Every dawn brought a new horizon, both a promise and a terrifying reminder of how utterly lost you might truly be. The compass of the ancients was courage, and its needle, your unwavering resolve. Life aboard the Serpent's Embrace became a study in endurance, a stark lesson in the reduction of existence to its most basic, brutal elements. 40 men, huddled together for warmth and safety, transformed the open deck into a cramped living cage. The air thickened with the smells of damp wool, unwashed bodies, stale breath, and the ever-present stench of dried fish and tar. Personal space was a forgotten luxury. You slept shoulder to shoulder, a shifting, murmuring mass of humanity, the rhythmic creak of the ship your lullaby, the spray your constant companion. Rations were meager, precisely measured, and a source of constant gnawing hunger. Hardtack, dry and tough as boot leather, dipped in watered-down ale, or the infrequent rainwater you managed to collect, was your staple. Dried fish, cured to withstand months at sea, was so salty it burned your tongue and lips. Sometimes you'd catch a glimpse of the Jarl, stoic and uncomplaining, chewing slowly on his portion, and you'd find a renewed resolve not to grouse. Every morsel was precious, guarded like gold. Your body, once solid and strong, began to hollow, your ribs more prominent, your movements slower, each task demanding an immense effort. The constant dampness bred sores and rashes, and the salt water chafed skin already. Raw from endless exposure. Basic hygiene was a distant memory, a forgotten indulgence from a life that seemed impossibly far away. The constant threat of the unknown was a pervasive, insidious presence, more terrifying than any visible danger. It was in the endless grey expanse, the feeling that you were sailing off the very edge of the world, into a realm where the laws of nature might cease to apply. The sagas told of sea monsters, of kraken large enough to capsize ships, of malevolent spirits haunting the fog. And in the deepening isolation, these tales took on a chilling reality. Every strange sound, every shift in the vast dark waters, every unexpected shadow became a potential harbinger of doom. You found yourself scanning the horizons, not just for land, but for the monstrous, for the impossible. But beyond the mythical, there was the very real unknown of the land itself. What awaited you there? Savage tribes with painted faces and obsidian weapons, vast impenetrable forests teeming with beasts, or an empty, desolate wilderness, a cruel joke played by the gods. This uncertainty gnawed at the edges of your courage, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of your conscious thoughts. The isolation was perhaps the heaviest burden. Days bled into weeks, weeks into an eternity, without sight of another human soul or a familiar landmark. The world shrank to the confines of the longship, a tiny wooden speck in an immeasurable ocean. Conversation became sparse, then strained, then gave way to long periods of silence, punctuated only by the roar of the wind and waves. You were a communal entity, yet profoundly, utterly alone with your thoughts, your fears, your dwindling hope. You watched your kinsmen, gaunt faces etched with weariness, eyes that held the same terrifying questions as your own. Arguments flared over trivial slights, over a shared blanket, over a perceived inequity in rations, symptoms of minds stretched to their breaking point. Yet, these moments of tension were always brief, quickly extinguished by the shared understanding that your survival depended on unity, on the fragile bonds forged in the crucible of hardship. Fear, hot and cold, was your constant companion. It wasn't just the fear of death, though that was ever present, a shadow lurking in the waves and winds. It was the fear of failure, of having embarked on this impossible journey only to vanish without a trace. The fear of madness, of the mind snapping under the relentless pressure of isolation and the unknown. You would wake in the dark, heart hammering, convinced the ship was sinking, or that unseen hands were pulling you beneath the waves. The whispers of the wind would sometimes sound like the voices of loved ones left behind, calling to you from across the ocean, a tormenting echo of what you had forgone. And yet, through it all, there was an immense, unyielding courage. It wasn't a roaring, heroic courage, but a quiet, stubborn defiance. It was the decision, every single morning, to rise from your cramped, sleeping space, to face another day of biting wind and endless sea. It was in the shared glance with a kinsman, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle, a mutual bolstering of spirits. It was in the steady, unwavering hand of the Jarl, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the horizon, his quiet commands a constant anchor in the chaos. This courage manifested in small acts, a shared sagas told around the single flickering lamp in the darkest hours, a rough, off-key song sung against the wind, a hand offered to a comrade struggling with a rope. It was the unspoken pact, the understanding that you would push on, not just for glory or plunder, but because you had started, and retreat was unthinkable. You had journeyed too far to turn back. The unknown called, and though your heart pounded with apprehension, there was also a fierce, primal curiosity, a burning need to see what lay at the end of this perilous embrace of the serpent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, came the signs. First, the birds, guillemots and gulls, not merely resting on the waves, but flying with a sense of purpose, heading westward. Then, the water itself seemed to change, losing its deep oceanic indigo for a greener, shallower hue. Floating logs, not merely fragments but substantial tree trunks, began to appear, silent messengers from an unseen land. A ripple of excitement, hushed and cautious, passed through the weary crew. Hope, a fragile, exquisite thing, began to bloom in your chest. And then, one morning, as the dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of fiery orange and purple, a shout rang out from the masthead, a sound that cut through the weariness and weeks of silence like a sharp blade. Land! Land to the west! Your heart leaped. You squinted, straining your eyes against the glare, and there it was, a faint, dark smudge on the distant horizon. Not a trick of light, not a cloud, but the unmistakable, unwavering outline of land. A collective gasp, then a roar of exhilaration erupted from the deck. A wave of profound relief, so powerful it almost brought you to your knees, washed over you. The fear, the isolation, the hunger, the storms, all of it faded, replaced by a renewed, almost desperate sense of purpose. The serpent's embrace had tested you, but it had not broken you. A new chapter of the unknown lay before you, and you, a Viking of the North, were ready to meet it. The relentless hunger of the North Atlantic had been our constant companion for weeks. A gnawing emptiness in the belly and a ceaseless yearning for sight of land. Days bled into weeks, the rhythm of the waves an unending lullaby of despair and hope. Then, one crisp morning, as the sun clawed its way above the horizon, painting the eastern sky in hues of fire and blood, a shout ripped through the cold air, a sound that jolted every weary soul from its stupor. Land ahoy! The cry, raw and charged with an almost desperate ecstasy, echoed across the deck of our Nar. You felt it before you saw it, a subtle shift in the wind, a faint earthy scent, carried on the breeze, pine needles, damp soil, something wild and untamed. It was a smell utterly alien, yet intoxicating. Squinting through the morning mist, your eyes, accustomed only to the endless blue, grey heave of the ocean, struggled to discern the distant smudge on the horizon. But there it was, growing steadily, solidifying into a jagged line of dark green against the paler sky. As we drew closer, the smudginess resolved into an impossible tapestry of verdant forests. Stretching further than the eye could see, a colossal, untouched wilderness. There were no signs of man-made structures, no smoke plumes from distant hearths, no familiar outlines of settlements. This was pure, unadulterated creation, sculpted by the gods themselves. A collective gasp rippled through the crew, a mixture of awe and disbelief. The air grew warmer, sweeter, laden with the scent of blossoming things you couldn't name. We found a wide, sandy beach, sheltered by a small bay, the water surprisingly clear and calm. As the keel grated against the shore, a silence fell, thick and pregnant with anticipation. You were among the first to leap into the cool shallows, your boots sinking into the soft sand. The ground beneath our feet felt firm, unyielding, a blessed contrast to the pitching deck. And what a land it was! Before us lay a veritable paradise, a stark, glorious contradiction to the harsh, rock-strewn shores of our homeland. Towering trees unlike any we had ever seen rose majestically there, branches reaching towards the heavens, forming an impenetrable canopy. Beneath them, the forest floor was a riot of life. Ferns unfurled in, vibrant green, berries hung in profusion from bushes, and everywhere, wild grapes clambered over trees and rocks, their heavy clusters swollen with juice, begging to be plucked. It was as if Odin himself had prepared a feast for us. Vinland, shouted Leif Erikson, his voice hoarse with emotion, his axe raised to the sky. The land of grapes, the sagas spoke truly. The men cheered, their voices echoing in the pristine air. We drank from crystal-clear streams, the water sweeter than mead, and gorged ourselves on the abundant grapes and berries, the taste of fresh, unfarmed fruit, an almost spiritual experience after months of dried fish and hardtack. Huge salmon, glistening silver, practically leaped from the rivers and the forests, teemed with game, deer, elk, and strange furry creatures we had never encountered. This was not merely survival. This was bounty beyond our wildest dreams. This was a land that promised everything. It felt like a fresh start, a clean slate, a place where our children could thrive. Far from the petty squabbles and dwindling resources of the old world. For a fleeting moment, all hardship, all doubt, all fear of the unknown melted away, replaced by an intoxicating sense of wonder and boundless possibility. We had found our new home. The initial euphoria, however, soon gave way to a more cautious wonder. Our keen Viking senses, honed by generations of adapting to hostile environments, began to pick up subtle cues. Broken branches where no storm had passed, faint trails through the undergrowth, the fleeting shadow of movement at the edge of our vision. We knew we were not alone. Our first encounter with the land's inhabitants was inevitable, and it came swiftly. We were exploring inland, scouting for a suitable place to establish a more permanent settlement, when a small party of them emerged from the tree line, silent as ghosts. They were unlike us in every conceivable way, shorter, with skin the color of rich earth and dark, piercing eyes that missed nothing. Their hair was black and coarse, often braided, and their faces were painted, with intricate patterns that seemed both fearsome and starkly beautiful. They wore garments fashioned from animal hides, adorned with feathers and shells. Leif called for his men to hold their ground, hands instinctively tightening on axe hilts and sword grips. We numbered perhaps 24. They were fewer, maybe 10 or 12, armed with bows, spears, and stone axes. Their language was a rapid-fire torrent of guttural sounds and sharp clicks, utterly incomprehensible to our ears. They were the Skraelings, as the sagas called them, the wretches or screamers. Yet observing them, there was no wretch about them. They moved with an agile grace that spoke of a deep connection to this land, a familiarity we coveted but could not yet claim. Leif, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, empty hands visible, attempting to convey peaceful intent. He offered a small iron axe head, a precious commodity, in an effort to initiate trade. The Skraelings eyed it with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. One of them, seemingly their leader, a man whose face was marked by an old scar and whose gaze held a formidable intensity, approached cautiously. He took the axe head, examined it, and then, to our surprise, offered a bundle of exquisite furs in return. For a few days, a tentative peace held. We traded our iron tools, beads, and woven cloths for their valuable furs, fresh game, and dried fish. It was a strange, silent dance of gesture and gaze, each side studying the other with a wary fascination. There were even moments of shared laughter, born from the sheer absurdity of our mutual incomprehension. You saw some of our younger men try to mimic their strange dances, much to the amusement of both parties. But the peace was fragile, built on the shifting sands of ignorance and mistrust. We saw their numbers grow, more canoes appearing on the rivers, more watchful eyes in the forest. They began to eye our metal tools, our longships, and our burgeoning camp, not just with curiosity, but with a growing covetousness. We, in turn, began to grow wary of their sudden appearances and disappearances. Their knowing glances, the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. The inevitable clash began over something trivial, a broken tab, a misunderstanding about territory. One of our men, zealous in his efforts to clear land for a new longhouse, encroached upon a sacred grove, unknowingly disturbing a burial site. The Skraelings reacted with a fury that startled us, their usually reserved demeanor shattering into a storm of guttural war cries and a hail of arrows. The arrows, tipped with sharpened flint, were crude but deadly. They were not the steel bolts of our European wars, but they found their marks, tearing through flesh, leaving jagged wounds. We were caught off guard. 3 of our men fell in the initial ambush, their screams cutting. Short as the Skraelings vanished back into the dense foliage as quickly as they had appeared. The dream of a peaceful Vinland shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a struggle for survival. Establishing our temporary settlement became a desperate race against time and an unseen enemy. We selected a defensible promontory overlooking the bay, its back shielded by a thick forest, its front facing the open water. Our axes, once used for felling trees for shipbuilding, now carved out a harsh existence from this rich land. We worked tirelessly, felling the towering pines and oaks to construct a stockade, a sturdy wall of sharpened logs bristling outwards like the quills of a frightened porcupine. Inside, we erected several rough longhouses, their walls thick with mud and turf, to serve as shelters and a place to store our dwindling supplies. Every clang of an axe, every grunt of effort carried a morbid echo across the vast, silent land, a stark reminder that we were intruders. The rich, earthy smell of freshly turned soil was now mixed with the acrid scent of wood smoke from our constantly burning fires, a beacon in the wilderness that both warmed and betrayed our presence. Resource gathering became a perilous endeavor. Hunting parties, once jovial excursions, were now tense, heavily armed forays. Into the depths of the forest, eyes constantly scanning the shadows. You learned to read the woods differently, to spot the faintest disturbance on the forest floor. The subtle shift of leaves, the distant snap of a twig that wasn't caused by an animal. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, seemed to hide a potential threat. The abundant game was still there, but securing it felt like stealing from a watchful host. We fished the rivers, but even then, a silent canoe might drift into view, its occupants watching. Us with unnerving stillness before silently paddling away, leaving a lingering chill in our hearts. Sleep, for many, became a luxury. The nights were long and filled with disquiet. The strange cries of nocturnal animals seemed to mock our vulnerability, and sometimes, from the deeper parts of the forest, we heard distant, rhythmic drumming, a haunting sound that spoke of unseen gatherings of plans being made. Sentries stood watch with drawn swords and strung bows, their eyes strained, peering into the inky blackness beyond the stockade. You took your turn, the cold night air biting at your exposed skin, your grip on your weapon numb. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of wind rustling the leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Your heart hammered against your ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. The Skraelings proved to be formidable adversaries. They fought with a ferocity born of defending their homeland, employing guerrilla tactics that our traditional European warfare was ill-equipped to counter. They would appear suddenly, strike swift and hard with arrows and spears, and then melt back into the impenetrable forest, leaving behind wounded and dead, and a profound sense of frustration and dread. They were masters of ambush, their knowledge of the terrain absolute. We were outsiders, clumsy and loud, struggling to adapt to their silent, deadly dance. We built a forge, its bellows roaring to life, to repair our tools and to craft more effective weapons. But even with our superior iron, their numbers and intimate knowledge of the land often negated our technological advantage. We learned the hard way that a well-placed flint arrow from a hidden hunter could fell even the strongest Viking. The initial awe and wonder had given way to a grim determination. Vinland, the land of grapes and plenty, had become Vinland, the land of constant vigilance and bloodshed. The dream of a new home was quickly being redefined, forged in the fires of conflict and tempered by the unforgiving reality of a vast, untamed continent that already had its masters. We were no longer explorers, we were besieged, fighting for every breath, every meal, every sliver of territory. The green paradise, once so inviting, now felt like a cage, its bars fashioned from dense forest and the watchful, hostile eyes of its true inhabitants. The great adventure had become a desperate struggle for survival, far from home, outnumbered, and increasingly isolated, with only our wits and our axes to protect us. The question was no longer if we could claim this land, but how long we could hope to hold it. The biting wind whips your cloak around you, tasting of salt, and the untamed wildness of the sea. You grip the rough-hewn railing of the longship, the creak of the timbers a familiar lullaby against the roar of the waves. It's been weeks, months, since you last saw the familiar fjords of your homeland. Now, a new world stretches before you, vast and green and strange. You are among the first of your kin to set foot on these shores, to call this place Vinland. Leif Erikson, our chieftain, spoke of the promise, forests so dense they seemed to hold their own secrets, rivers teeming with salmon, and fertile land ripe for the taking. And at first, it seemed true. The air was sweeter than any you'd breathed, the sunlight warmer. We established our settlement, a cluster of sturdy longhouses against the sprawling wilderness. We cleared land, built fires, and shared tales under skies unburdened by the watchful eyes of kings or priests. There were moments, as you recall them now, of a quiet contentment, a feeling of having found a true home. But the echo of the sea, the very force that brought us here, also whispered of uncertainty. The seasons here are different, their rhythms wilder. The winters, you remember them vividly, were not just cold, they were fierce. Snow piled high against our doors, the wind a relentless sculptor of ice. Food stores dwindled, and the forests that once seemed so generous grew silent, their bounty hidden or gone. We were a small band, isolated by leagues of unforgiving ocean. Every illness, every injury, felt magnified by our distance from home. More unsettling, though, were the Skraelings, the natives of this land. At first, our encounters were cautious, even curious. They were different, their ways alien to us, yet there was a shared humanity. They traded, offering furs and knowledge of the land in exchange for iron and our own rudimentary wares. You remember the glint of their eyes, the way they moved with an effortless grace, through the trees that we, with our heavy boots and armor, could only envy. There was a trade, a tentative peace. But the peace was fragile. Like a thin sheet of ice over deep water, it could break with the slightest pressure. Tensions flared. Misunderstandings, born of language barriers and deeply ingrained cultural differences, ignited into conflict. You saw it happen, the fear in the eyes of your comrades, the fierce protectiveness in the faces of the Skraelings. Battles were fought, small skirmishes at first, then more desperate clashes. The dream of Vinland began to fray at the edges, replaced by the grim reality of survival against a hostile environment and an increasingly wary, even hostile, indigenous population. And so, the question that still hangs in the salt-laced air like a phantom fog, why did the Vikings ultimately abandon their Vinland settlement despite its promise? It wasn't one single event, you understand now, listening to the rustling leaves that sound like whispers from the past. It was a confluence of factors, a perfect storm of hardship, the unforgiving winters, a constant drain on resources and morale, the sheer distance from home, a psychological and logistical gulf that made resupply and reinforcement an almost insurmountable challenge. And then, the escalating conflict with the Skraelings, a people who knew this land as their own, who were not about to yield it to strangers. Our numbers were too few, our hold too precarious. The promise of Vinland began to feel less like a beacon and more like a siren's call, luring us onto the jagged rocks of oblivion. We left, not in defeat exactly, but in pragmatism. We packed what little we could, our hearts heavy with the echoes of what might have been. The longhouses were left to the elements, silent monuments to our brief sojourn. We sailed back west, a smaller, wiser crew. Yet as you stand here centuries later, the question of leaving isn't the only one that lingers. What about the lasting impact? The subtle, often overlooked influence of these early encounters on both cultures. We were but a fleeting presence, a ripple on the surface of a vast ocean. But even ripples can leave their mark. Did we leave behind more than just abandoned dwellings? Perhaps scattered tools, a few hardy strains of grain that took root, or even in the oral traditions of the Skraelings, tales of the fair-haired, blue-eyed strangers who arrived in wooden dragons. And what did we take with us? Beyond the furs and the timber, we carried back stories, a wealth of knowledge about navigation, about the resilience of the human spirit, and a glimpse of a continent teeming with a beauty and a wildness we had only dreamed of. We brought back an understanding of different ways of life, of peoples whose existence challenged our own worldview. These weren't just voyages of discovery, they were encounters that, however brief, chipped away at the perceived boundaries of the known world for both us and them. The sagas speak of Vinland, of course, but often in a tone that blends myth with memory. For centuries, these tales were dismissed by many as mere folklore, the fantastical ramblings of ancient seafarers. But then the ground itself began to speak. Archaeological discoveries, like the one at Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland, confirmed the saga's whispers. The remnants of Viking longhouses, artifacts, and even Norse-style iron, smelting furnaces provided irrefutable evidence of our presence. Each trowel of earth turned, each shard of pottery unearthed, adds another layer to the ongoing debate. How new discoveries and research continue to refine our understanding of this pivotal period. Was Lonzo Meadows the only settlement? Was it a permanent home or a seasonal outpost? How extensive was our exploration of North America? Were the conflicts with the Skraelings as widespread and as violent as some interpretations suggest? These are the questions that drive modern scholarship, where historians, archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists collaborate, piecing together fragments of evidence like a grand, complex mosaic. You can almost hear the hushed tones in a dimly lit university library, the scent of old paper mingling with the excitement of a new breakthrough. New dating techniques reveal more precise timelines. Analysis of historical texts, once overlooked, is re-examined with fresh perspectives. Genetic studies, though still in their infancy regarding this period, hint at potential ancestral connections that were once unimaginable. The narrative of transcontinental discovery is no longer a straightforward tale of Columbus's triumphant arrival. It's a far richer, more nuanced story, one that acknowledges the long, arduous journey that began long before his ships sailed. It's a story that honors the Vikings, not just as raiders, but as intrepid explorers who dared to cross the unforgiving Atlantic, who glimpsed a continent that would remain largely unknown to Europe for centuries. And you, standing here, are a part of that ongoing story. You are the listener, the one who imagines yourself on that longship, feeling the spray on your face, the ache in your muscles, the thrill of the unknown. You are the one who grapples with the questions of why we left, what impact we had, and how much more there is still to uncover. The echoes of that forgotten empire, the legacy left behind, are not silent. They are woven into the very fabric of history, waiting for us to listen, to learn, and to understand. The wind still blows, carrying with it the whispers of Vinland, a testament to the enduring human spirit of exploration and the indelible marks we leave upon the world, however faint they may seem. The roar of the North Atlantic wind, a constant living thing, still echoes in your ears. The tang of salt and pine sap clings to your imagined fur cloak, even now, safe in the quiet hum of your own time. You were there, weren't you? You felt the deck pitch beneath your boots, the spray stinging your eyes as the longship, a slender serpent of wood and sail, cut through the steel-grey waves. You stood shoulder to shoulder with Leif Erikson's crew, glimpsed the verdant shores of Vinland, the land of grapes, and helped raise the first timber frames of a temporary settlement, a fragile bastion against the vast, untamed wilderness. You remember the thrill, the trepidation, the bounty of the land, timber thicker than any in Greenland, salmon teeming in rivers, berries sweet and abundant. But you also remember the shadows, the rustle in the trees, the piercing calls of the Skraelings, the indigenous peoples, whose land this truly was. You remember the cautious dances of trade and the sudden brutal clashes that ultimately made the dream of a permanent Norse outpost crumble, reducing it to a few fire-blackened longhouses and the whispers of sagas. But what if? What if the winds of fate had shifted just slightly? What if that first harsh winter had yielded to a milder spring, or the encounters with the Skraelings had blossomed into lasting alliances instead of skirmishes? Lean back, close your eyes, and let's cast our minds further back, further into that potent what if. Imagine for a moment that you didn't just survive that first winter, you thrived. You, the imagined explorer, found a sheltered bay, a natural harbor impervious to the fiercest storms. You discovered veins of bog iron, enough to sustain tool-making. And crucially, a series of diplomatic overtures, perhaps led by a more patient, more understanding chieftain, forged an uneasy peace, then a tentative trade with the Micmac or Beothuk peoples. The initial settlement, Lanceau Meadows, would not have been abandoned. Instead, it became a foothold. Over decades, not merely years, more ships would arrive from Greenland and Iceland, drawn by tales of abundant resources and fertile lands. These weren't mere raiders or temporary traders, these were settlers, families, carpenters, smiths, farmers, priests. Imagine the cultural tapestry that would have begun to weave itself. The Norse with their iron tools, their domesticated livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, and their knowledge of deep-sea sailing would have offered valuable goods. The indigenous peoples, masters of the land, would have provided invaluable knowledge of local flora and fauna, hunting techniques, and sustainable living in this new world. Perhaps after a generation or two, a new language would have emerged. A Creole tongue blending Old Norse with the Algonquian dialects. Picture children, born on this new frontier, their names a mix of their Viking ancestors, and their indigenous neighbors, a girl named Freydis Ayana, a boy Eric Wabban. They would grow up equally adept at sailing a nar through coastal waters and paddling a birch-bark canoe through winding rivers. They would learn to read runes carved into stone and to interpret the intricate patterns of the stars that guided both cultures. Villages would sprout, not just along the coast, but inland, following the river systems. The Norse longhouse, adapted to the local climate, might incorporate indigenous building techniques, becoming more insulated, more camouflaged within the forests. Churches, simple wooden structures initially, would rise alongside sacred indigenous sites, sometimes in respectful proximity, sometimes in quiet competition for spiritual devotion. Agriculture would transform the landscape in places. Norse grains, barley, rye, would be planted alongside indigenous staples like corn and squash, creating a resilient, diverse food system. Iron axes would clear forests faster, allowing for more expansive settlements and farms. But the indigenous understanding of forest management and biodiversity would temper unchecked expansion. Now, fast forward several centuries. It's the 1400s. The New World isn't new at all. It's a land known as Vestri Vinland, West Vinland, home to a unique, hybridized civilization. Its largest coastal cities, perhaps once called Leifsbudir or Eriksfjord, now boast a distinct architectural style, sturdy stone, and timber buildings reminiscent of Norwegian stave churches, yet infused with the organic fluidity of indigenous artistry. Runes and syllabics might adorn public buildings, telling parallel stories of creation and history. When Columbus, in this altered timeline, eventually stumbles upon the Caribbean, his amazement would be tempered by existing knowledge. Perhaps he wouldn't be the first to attempt to claim these lands, but merely another explorer encountering lands already partially mapped, at least by the Norse indigenous people of Vestri Vinland. The impact, while still profound, would not be the shock of discovery, but rather a convergence of worlds that had already begun, centuries earlier, on a different North American shore. The transatlantic slave trade might have manifested differently, or been challenged earlier by a society that had already navigated the complexities of cultural exchange and intermarriage. The devastating impact of European diseases, while still a threat given the long isolation, might have encountered a population already somewhat diversified, through generations of interaction or with a greater understanding of quarantine through the lessons learned from earlier, smaller outbreaks. The narrative of European superiority would be much harder to uphold in the face of a thriving independent North American Norse Indigenous Confederation with its own unique history and power structures. This alternative history is tantalizing, isn't it? It challenges the very foundations of how we understand the discovery and colonization of the Americas. It reframes the story not as a sudden singular event, but as a potential series of encounters, a gradual unfolding of global connections. Now, let's step back from that imagined past and return to our present, where the whispers of Vinland were largely forgotten for centuries, rediscovered only in the sagas and, thrillingly, in the archaeological ruins of Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland. The enduring fascination with Viking exploration today is testament to the power of these what-if scenarios and the profound human drive to explore, to discover, to cross horizons. Why are we so captivated? Perhaps it's the sheer audacity of it all, small wooden ships navigating an impossibly vast and hostile ocean, guided only by stars, sun, and an innate sense of direction. It speaks to the primal adventurer within us, the spirit that pushes boundaries and questions the limits of the known world. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were master mariners, shrewd traders, and skilled artisans. Their sagas, full of epic journeys and larger-than-life characters, continue to inspire authors, filmmakers, and gamers, finding new life in television series like Vikings and countless historical fiction novels. But beyond the romance and the adventure, the story of Vinland holds a deeper significance. It forces us to confront the established narratives, to peel back the layers of history taught in textbooks, and to question who gets to write the first chapter. For generations, Columbus discovered America was an undisputed truth. The discovery of Lanceau Meadows in 1960 and its subsequent recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site definitively proved otherwise. It shattered a myth, opening the door to a more nuanced, complex, and ultimately more accurate understanding of transatlantic contact. The Vikings weren't the first people in North America. Indigenous peoples had inhabited these lands for millennia. But they were the first documented Europeans to set foot here. Their fleeting presence, even without enduring, irrevocably altered the historical record, pushing back the timeline of European contact by nearly 500 years. This realization is a call to action, dear listener. It's an invitation to you, the modern explorer, to delve deeper. Don't simply accept the stories handed down through generations. Question them. Seek out the voices that were silenced, the histories that were marginalized. Research the indigenous nations whose lands were first encountered, long before any European banner was planted. Read the Norse sagas, not just as tales of adventure, but as historical documents, flawed perhaps, but rich with insight. Visit, if you can, these places where history was made, or almost made. Lanceau Meadows stands as a quiet monument, a place where you can almost hear the winds whispering the sagas of Leif Erikson and Freydis Eriksdottir. It reminds us that history is not a static, finished book, but a living, breathing narrative, constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted with every new discovery, every new perspective. So, put on your metaphorical fur cloak again. Feel the imagined pitch of the longship beneath your feet. The uncharted horizons aren't just across oceans, they're in the unexplored corners of history, in the questions we dare to ask, and in the narratives we choose to embrace. Go forth, seeker of knowledge, and chart your own course through the waters of what was and what could have been. The journey inward, into the depths of historical truth, is perhaps the most epic odyssey of all.